Welcome back to Face the Nation. We turn now to the top Democrat on the Commerce Committee, Washington State Senator Maria Cantwell. Good to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, Senator, you heard the Senate whip talk about your effort to claw back some control over trade. He said it will have a thorough hearing and we'll see where it goes from there. Do you have any indication of momentum among some of your Republican colleagues?
Well, the first day of introduction, we signed up 7 Republicans. So usually you don't get a first introduction and get so many people on board. But I think it shows the anxiety that people have. I'm sure if they listen to their constituents, consumer challenges are already starting to surface, and certainly the stock market's impact on retirement income is shaking a lot of people. So I'm sure my colleagues will hear from them. Today, consumer groups are announcing, and retailers, the fact that they want Congress to take this action up. And so I think we're hearing from a big segment of the economy. The consumer spending is a big part of GDP, and they're worried.
So you've got, what, 6 Republicans at this point?
7.
7. Mm-hmm. And now you're saying retailers, like you have CEOs who are on board, or industry groups?
Industry groups like the Retailers Association, the outdoor industry, the consumer electronics groups, Main Street Alliance, organizations who know their bread and butter comes from consumer spending, which is a big part of our economy. And so they are very anxious about a plan. Listen, I listened to your segment. I've never heard so much about fuzzy math in my life. And the notion that that chart is getting so much national attention, you know, the letters in Greek alphabet, all this stuff that makes no sense. That's what consumers are saying. How is this helping me in a time of inflation? You're adding to my cost with a tax on my consumer goods. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's why we're gaining support from these organizations today.
So Canada and China are among your state's largest export markets. Both have already announced retaliatory tariffs. I know you've said previously that the first Trump administration and the more limited tariffs still to this day have an impact on your state. So how much wiggle room do we have with time here? Because you heard the Commerce Secretary say that basically these aren't a negotiating ploy, that they are staying in place. That's what he says.
Well,
so how long before damage?
Well, we have seen damage from the first Trump tariffs on things like apples, and markets closed. And what you do is you end up then losing farm family economies. You don't necessarily lose farmland. Some big corporation might buy it, but you lose family farms. So our objective should be to help farmers open up doors to these overseas markets. The United States' goal here should be to make great manufactured products and grow great agricultural products and then get those markets opened up. But what the president is doing is, instead of building those alliances, he basically is getting into a trade war that is having unbelievable impact. When his last tariffs on India, we reopened with the Apple market, and we went to India and said, let's get rid of this, and we were successful. And that's the kind of action we want to see today.
So your state is one of the top 5 unionized states in the country. You have the world's largest plane manufacturer, Boeing, in Washington. So I wonder if those union workers are as supportive of the tariffs as the auto industry workers have been. They are not against them, even though some are Democrats. In fact, they think some of them, including on this program, like Sean Fain, have been very supportive.
Well, we're seeing, you could get the letter from the Machinists International. They don't support the president on this. And that is because they understand how much the United States and Canada have become an integrated supply chain. That helped us lower the cost of U.S. manufacturing for cars and for airplanes. And lowering that cost means that we're even more competitive. So they don't like the uncertainty. And what they would like to see instead is the continuation of investment from the last administration. So when you think of chips and science, and you think of the Inflation Reduction Act that made investments in next generation technology, the sectors that have a lot of employees want to win on innovation. They know that investment in innovation will help us outpace our competition, not a tariff that makes the product more expensive.
So Boeing CEO testified 80% of the airplanes they deliver are to markets outside the U.S. 80% of the content of those airplanes are manufactured here. They have a vested interest in clearing the decks for themselves here. What are they telling you about their conversations with the administration?
Well, everybody's concerned that the administration might retaliate against them, that, that if they're not front and center in this debate, but they're clear that they are being heard. I think people are saying that their strategy is if there's a demand for 40,000 airplanes and we could increase 1,000 more planes being sold, it would have a huge impact on the trade deficit. So they're trying to say, Mr. President, don't cut the innovation and investment. Don't make semiconductors more expensive. Don't make the parts more expensive. Make it cheaper. And the United States bet on the American worker, and they will do the rest when it comes to the innovation that's required for America to build the best products. So I think the president's math is wrong. I think he doesn't know that calculus is going to be so devastating to American consumers, and that's why those groups are joining us today.
Senator Cantwell, thank you for your time today.
Thank you.
We'll be right back. We go now to Nebraska Republican Congressman Don Bacon, who joins us this morning from Omaha. Congressman, I have a lot to get to with you on a number of topics here, but just to pick up on the tariffs that we've been speaking about, I know you are introducing companion legislation to what Senator Cantwell just laid out for us. But as I understand it, in the House, Republican leaders have already restricted the ability to rein in changes to the Mexico, Canada, and China tariffs. They tucked language into the continuing resolution. Does that get in your way when you are trying to now claw back some congressional control of tariffs?
Well, first of all, good morning, Margaret. Thanks for having me on. And I enjoyed listening to Senator Cantwell. I support the legislation that Senator Grassley, Senator Cantwell, we have a total of 7 Republicans in the Senate. And I have some beginning support on the House side, which we'll unveil tomorrow. It will be harder to pass this in the House, no doubt. I think if we get 60 votes in the Senate, they'll put pressure on the House to look at this. And if we continue to see the stock market go a certain direction, or if we see inflation or unemployment shift in a bad way, I think then this bill becomes a very viable bill. So it will not pass tomorrow or maybe in the next couple of weeks, but this will be in the queue that we can use. And it's time that Congress restores its authorities here. In the Constitution, it's clear. The House and the Senate, Congress has the power of tariffs and taxes, and we gave some of that power to the executive branch. And I think in hindsight, that was a mistake.
But I hear you saying you have some momentum. Respectfully, sir, the president talked all the time during the campaign about tariffs. He put them at the centerpiece of his policy. He talked about the glory days of the 1800s and wanting to go back to him. Did Republicans just not take him seriously?
Well, there's a couple of facets to your question, Margaret. It's a good question. You're right, though. When you look back, it was Republican-supported tariffs in the 1800s. And up through about 1930, when we passed the Smoot-Hartley Act, that created one of the worst depression we ever had. We learned from that tariffs and protectionism does not work, and that free trade, in the end, as long as it's fair, we want fair trade. And I support the president wanting to get fairness. Some of these countries do treat us wrong, but fair trade should be the goal. And you're right, the president talked about this. He did not hide, as this is part of his agenda. But here's my take on it, and I've been studying politics since I was like 13 years old. People voted for President Trump because of the border, and he has really delivered there. They voted for him, too, because inflation surpassed wage increases. They were poorer today than they were 4 years ago. And I really think people voted for President Trump because of that, the border, and maybe crime. They saw crime in the big cities. I don't think, in the end, I don't think tariffs was really a big factor in people's decision-making when it came to last November.
Yeah, I know we certainly covered them on this program. And it is surprising to me, or perhaps it shouldn't be, that the business community is so silent right now. As Senator Cantwell said, she said they're afraid. But there is a conservative group, the New Civil Liberties Alliance, that filed suit to challenge these tariffs in court. Do you think it is the courts where this ultimately gets settled?
I think ultimately it's in Congress once we see enough of this, but maybe the courts as well. The Constitution makes it very clear. Congress has control of taxes. And by the way, and let's be candid, tariffs are a tax. But they also mentions tariffs in the Constitution. And we gave the president emergency powers. So the courts will have to decide is what just happened. Is this emergency powers or is this a total change in tariff policy? And I think it's really the latter. This is where Congress has to step in and say, do we really want to create this new policy on tariffs? And if it is, it should come from the Congress and not the president.
I want to ask you as well about your work on the Armed Services Committee. President Trump has fired the top 2 officials at the head of the very powerful National Security Agency. It's one of the most powerful intelligence agencies we have. It vacuums up information around the world through wiretapping, signals intercepts, and they work with the military, with Cyber Command. Have you received any explanation to Congress as to why General Hawk, the 4-star general unanimously confirmed to the job, was suddenly dismissed?
Margaret, I have not, but let me just comment on this. General Hawk is the absolute best leader in the U.S. military to lead Cyber Command and National Security Agency. He commanded both because half of Cyber Command relies on NSA to be effective in cyber operations. So you have to have this team. He was in charge of both. He served 34 years in the military, and his entire career was working signals intelligence or cyber operations. Frankly, he is the best that we had. And they also fired the number 2 person at National Security Agency without an explanation. I will tell you, this puts us back. It hurts us. I will tell you, Russia and China today are laughing at us because we just fired the absolute best leaders, the most qualified guys that we spent 3.5 decades preparing to have this role, and he's gone. And it's heartbreaking to see that that decision was made without explanation, and it hurt us.
And our reporting as a network is that it came as a decision following an Oval Office meeting with a right-wing activist named Laura Loomer, who has spread conspiracy theories about 9/11, said anti-Muslim, anti-immigrant things, racist things. It also happened as at least 6 other National Security Council officials at the White House were dismissed on the advice of Laura Loomer. I'm wondering, again, respectfully, sir, Republicans are controlling, you have oversight. Are there going to be hearings on this? Are there other Republicans who are concerned and going to do something about it?
I'm sure there'll be some oversight. I'm the chairman of the cyber subcommittee, and so I will guarantee you that we will have various military leaders. We'll have the Secretary of Defense speak to us, and he will be asked about this.
Did he even know?
I don't know that he know, but we'll find out when we ask him. We'll ask, but they'll say that this is the president's right, and the president does have constitutional right to do this, but it doesn't make it appropriate he may have the constitutional authority to do it, but it doesn't make it right. And in the end, I'm going to make it clear, we just removed the most qualified military leader that we had to run Cyber Command and NSA, and we will ask about it. Now, we have oversight. That doesn't mean we can. The president does have the constitutional authority to do this, but we have an opportunity to probe into this and ask why. And I have a responsibility to make clear this is wrong. It hurt us. It hurt our country.
Very quickly, do you think it is so that the president can split up those 2 commands and put someone of his own choosing, a political ally, at the top of the NSA?
You know, it's possible. I know that's out there, but I would say that's a mistake. NSA is very important to Cyber Command. You cannot do Cyber Command without the inputs from the National Security Agency, the SIGINT. If you separate and put them under 2 different commands, then you're going to create a dysfunctional partnership, and it will hurt our cyber operations against China and Russia.
Okay. Congressman, we'd love to have you back for another conversation about cyber one time. We have to leave it there. We'll be back in a moment. On Friday, we spoke with NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte and began our conversation by asking about the potential impact of the Trump administration's sweeping global tariffs on the security alliance.
There are tensions between allies because of this tariff question, but this is not concerning the alliance as a whole. because there will be potentially impact on the economies, but not to an extent that it will impact our collective defense. That's my firm conviction.
The next summit is now going to be held in June, and leaders there are expected to hike the military budget spending goal from 2% to 3%. The Trump administration wants it all the way up to spending about 5% on a country's own defense. How do you convince members to spend more to counter the threat from Russia at a time when the U.S. is going closer to it and the U.S. is putting economic pressure on Europe?
What Trump has done since he came into office is break the deadlock when it comes to this terrible war in Ukraine, because we've got to stop the killing. We've got to stop the fighting, and I commend him for that. And then when it comes to defense spending, the last couple of months, here in the European side of NATO, it is staggering, the amounts of billions coming in. But we have to continue doing this because, as I said in December, if we would stick to the old 2%, we cannot defend ourselves here in 3 to 5 years.
But at the same time that President Trump is calling for a peace deal in Ukraine, there is this parallel, separate effort to repair America's relationship with Russia. Doesn't the U.S. getting closer to Russia undercut your efforts to counter Russia?
Of course, I'm not in the room when all these talks take place, but what I'm seeing from a distance and hearing from my American colleagues, and including the president, whom I visited a couple of weeks ago in a very successful meeting we had in the Oval Office, and then during lunch, there is this effort to bring this war to an end. The ball clearly is in the court of the Russians. They are not moving fast enough, is my impression, including the impression I'm getting from my American interlocutors, that Russia really has to do more to bring this war to an end. The Ukrainians are reeling close to the American position. And we have to see how far the Americans can get this. But I am completely supporting that effort, because this war of protection, it was unsustainable in the long term. So many people dying, so much of the Ukrainian infrastructure being damaged, cities being destroyed. This got to end.
General Cavoli, who you know well as the Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, the U.S. general, is here in Washington testifying this week. He said Russia intends to diminish U.S. leadership and influence. What is happening to NATO members here? And is Russia succeeding in this destabilization campaign?
What we are seeing in Europe, but also in the US, but let me speak for the European side of NATO, is that the Russians, through cyber attacks, assassination attempts, jamming commercial airplanes in the Baltic area, cyber attacks on the National Health Service in the United Kingdom, cutting critical undersea infrastructure between Baltic countries and Finland, and in other parts of the Baltic Sea. They're conducting this campaign. The good news is that as NATO, as collective, we are much, much better, not only at assessing what is happening, but also making sure that we prevent the next steps in this campaign from happening.
So that destabilization campaign has not halted or paused as these attempts to broker peace have been underway?
Well, I mean, this whole destabilization campaign is going on for years now.
Yeah.
And I have no day-to-day assessment, but the reports we are getting is that the Russians are still very active. We are still worried about, for example, the critical undersea infrastructure. But thanks to Chris Cavoli and in his role as Supreme Allied Commander, we have in less than 10 days brought together a big endeavor by European NATO allies in the Baltic Sea to really make it very difficult for the Russians to continue doing this. And again, they hate us for this, and I love that.
There are roughly about 90,000 or more U.S. troops stationed in Europe right now. Secretary Hegseth said Europe should not assume that presence is going to last forever. I know you say that the U.S. is committed to NATO, but do you have any sense of how fast or significant this kind of drawdown that's being mentioned by Hegseth could be? And is there a NATO backup plan?
There are no concrete plans for the drawdown. What we know, and Pete Hegseth was very clear on this, is that this US administration, but by the way, this is US policy since 2010, to pivot more towards Asia, towards the Indo-Pacific. And the agreement we have is that we will do whatever is necessary in a no surprises way. I completely acknowledge the fact that the United States has more theaters to attend to, not only the Euro-Atlantic, but also the Indo-Pacific. And by the way, also thanks to President Trump and his position on this, as NATO, we will be more and more active in the Indo-Pacific with our partners. I will visit Japan next week to have my meetings there with the senior leadership to see how we can intensify that strong relationship we already have with the Indo-Pacific.
You've raised concern that China is building towards 1,000 nuclear warheads by 2030. Is that a direct threat to NATO?
It is a direct threat to the stability in the whole world, including NATO territory, absolutely. They have now more Navy ships sailing than the United States. We have a problem, the United States part of NATO, the Canadian part of NATO, European part of NATO, that we are not producing enough defense industrial products. We are producing in a full year in ammunition what Russia is producing in 3 months. That's totally crazy. And that's why the President and I discussed, and the other senior leaders in the US and I discussed also with European allies, that we have not only to ramp up spending, but also the defense industrial production. That includes cutting the red tape, both in the US and here in Europe.
All right, just to quickly clarify, that China's nuclear arsenal is a direct threat to NATO.
Well, it's there not to be used against China. But I would say more generally, let's not be naive about China. The build-up of their armed forces is taking place at a pace which is incredible. And when we talk about Ukraine and bringing Ukraine to a durable end and a peace, a durable peace in the end, let's not forget that Russia is working with North Korea and China and Iran. And that in the end there is an audience of one watching what comes out of this. And that is the first secretary of the Communist Party of China, Xi Jinping. And he will assess, when there is a deal on Ukraine, who comes out on top. Is it the West or is it Russia? And if it is Russia, he would get his thoughts going about his territorial claims in the Indo-Pacific. So there are big risks involved. And that's why we have to bring Ukraine to a peace which is lasting, and that Putin will never try this again.
You can see our full interview on CBSNews.com and on our YouTube page. We'll be right back. That's it for us today. Thank you for watching. Until next week. For Face the Nation, I'm Margaret Brennan.